While Luther was the first Protestant leader, later in the 16th century, we'll see other important Protestant reformers. I want to touch on a few of those. One contemporary of Luther was Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli was Swiss, also a priest, and like Luther, he had some problems with what was going on in the church. So when Luther broke away, Zwingli decided to do the same. And Luther and Zwingli actually met up in the city of Marburg fairly early on into their Protestant careers. And they meant to sit down and sort of decide, okay, what do we as Protestants believe? Let's sort of make a declaration of our beliefs. And they realized pretty early on they actually had some pretty different beliefs. Now, a lot of the key things we've talked about, sola scriptura, sola fides, priesthood of believers, those they all believed. But some of the finer theological points, like the importance of sacraments and which things should be counted as sacraments and which they shouldn't, they really disagreed on. And so they walked away out of Marburg realizing that really what Luther had started was not just what he considered the new correct Christian church, but rather a movement of lots of different churches. So Zwingli is important in that sense that he was the first real different Protestant who disagreed with some of Luther's ideas. And we'll see later that other Protestants do the same. Another group of Protestants were the Anabaptists. They weren't as organized as, say, Luther or the Anglican Church. And there wasn't really a single leader, but they did share some common beliefs. One of those beliefs, where their name comes from, is that people couldn't be baptized as infants, which was the standard practice in the Catholic Church. Instead, they decided that people had to make the decision for themselves, and so people had to be baptized as adults. And therefore, people who were baptized as infants had to be baptized again, hence the name Anabaptist. Another important belief of the Anabaptists was that they should have a very strict separation of church and state, to the point where for Anabaptists, Christians, being members of the kingdom of God, shouldn't at all be involved in earthly matters. So Anabaptists, for example, wouldn't participate in the government, nor would they join the army. And that kind of put them in a difficult position with a lot of monarchs who, of course, as they're consolidating their power with religion, wanted to make sure they could do things like raise armies. So Anabaptists were often driven out of their homes. Many of them eventually wind up in the American colonies, and their descendants today are the Mennonites and Amish, who even today still sort of live separately from the rest of society. The most important reformer of the latter half of the 16th century was John Calvin. Calvin was a priest, like Luther and Zwingli and these other reformers. And inspired by Luther, he broke away from the church. He left France, where he was from, and fled to Switzerland, which was a little more Protestant, a little more less organized, so it was easier to sort of set things up there. And in Switzerland, he wrote a book called Institutes of Christian Religion, where he sort of explains his theology. And it turns out to be pretty different from other Protestants. One of the key ideas in Calvin's theology, which we generally call Calvinism, is the idea of total depravity. That means people are evil. Ever since Adam and Eve committed the first sin, everybody since then is just sort of naturally inclined to do bad. And there's real no way of changing that human behavior except by enforcing it through the laws. And as part of that too, Calvin had this idea of predestination. The root word there, pre, before, and destined is sort of your fate. And the idea is that, God knows everything, and he's always known everything. And he knows what everyone's going to do from before they're born all the way to the end of time. And therefore, God has already figured out who is going to merit salvation, who's going to get to go to heaven, and who's not. And so Calvin had this idea that some people were elect, that God had already chosen and set them aside, and they were going to heaven. And really, you have no real free will, because God already knows what's going to happen. And as part of this idea, Calvin had this sense that, if people do good things, well, you can tell they've already been saved. They're part of the elect, and God's going to treat his elect members pretty well. And so you have this idea that, if people seem to be good in society and they're pretty well off, then they must be predestined. They must be part of the elect. That's going to be a kind of important idea later on, as some people look back and think about how Protestantism sort of shaped the development of capitalism. If you think, for example, one way to show that you're elect is that you have lots of good stuff, we might be inclined to work harder. That's what some later sociologists would argue. Another key thing for Calvin was the relationship of church and state. When Calvin goes to Geneva in Switzerland, he actually sets up this government called the Consistory. And so essentially, Calvin makes a theocracy. In Geneva, Calvin could publicly deny people who thought were sinners the sacraments. Calvin didn't really believe in sacraments, but public preaching. If you didn't go to church, you could be taken to jail. If you were caught praying the Rosary, a Catholic prayer, then you might be as a sentence be made to listen to certain Protestant preachers. So he had this idea that, well, since people are bad, you've got to kind of make them good. You have this enforcement of putting the church and the state together. So sort of like Anglicanism, except much more religious. Calvin's ideas will spread. Usually you don't hear about like a Calvinist church like you would a Lutheran church, but most Calvinist ideology eventually formed what we call the Reformed churches. One of those Reformed churches is in Scotland. A Scot named John Knox lived in Geneva, studied under Calvin, and took those ideas back to Scotland. Now, in Scotland, which was already under control of England at the time, he couldn't set up his own government. So instead, he put the control of the society in the hands of a few, sort of church elders, not priests separately, but sort of these wise guys. And in Greek, the word for a wise person or wise elder is presbyter. And so they became the Presbyterians, and they're the descendants of the Presbyterian Church today. In France, the Calvinists were called Huguenots. And Huguenots really clashed in France. France was already a strongly Catholic country, and its government was strongly Catholic. But with the development of a new church, you saw some noble families convert to this new religion and try to get further up in society. And Catholics were afraid that they would be oppressed by these new Protestants, and the Huguenots, vice versa. So it led to really a lot of violence in France. There was an event called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in the 17th century, where for months Catholics would persecute and lynch Huguenots in the streets. So it became a really violent phase in the latter part of the Reformation.